The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that hums with quiet judgment. The ceiling fan turned lazily above, cutting through the heavy air thick with tension and whispered assumptions. All eyes were fixed on one young woman standing alone before the bench. Her name was Nia Thompson, 24 years old, sharp-eyed, calm, and composed in a simple navy blazer that looked a size too big. To most people in that room, she was just another name on a case file. But by the time this trial ended, that name, Nia Thompson, would echo across the nation. The charge? Obstruction of justice. But what she had really done was stand up for herself, and, as the world would soon find out, for something much, much bigger. Now, picture this. A marble courtroom, polished floors reflecting the light from tall arched windows, and a dozen faces staring at her like she didn't belong there. At the center of it all sat Judge Harold Whitmore, a man whose gray hair was as rigid as his beliefs. Known around the city for his sharp tongue and sharper biases, he had a reputation for putting people in their place. He adjusted his glasses, looked down from the bench, and said in that low, condescending tone that only years of unchecked authority can perfect, "Miss Thompson, are you sure you understand the charges against you?" There was the tone that dripped with polite insult, the kind that says, "You don't belong here." A few lawyers chuckled. One of them, a middle-aged man with slick hair and too much confidence, leaned to his colleague and whispered, loud enough for Nia to hear, "She probably can't even spell obstruction." Another snickered. Someone in the back coughed to hide their laugh. Now, most people would have crumbled under that. The laughter, the stares, the subtle humiliation. But not Nia. She didn't flinch. She didn't frown. She simply smiled, that quiet, knowing kind of smile that makes you wonder what she knows that you don't. She took a slow breath, her voice calm, but carrying just enough power to cut through the noise. "Your Honor," she said softly, "I understand them in 9 different languages." The courtroom went dead silent. Then came the sound, a collective gasp. Even the court stenographer looked up from her typewriter. And then, like a wave breaking, came the laughter. The judge leaned back in his chair, amused. He raised an eyebrow, smirked, and said, "9 languages? Is this a comedy act or a trial?" A few people chuckled again, trying to read the judge's mood. But Nia didn't laugh. She didn't even blink. She just tilted her head slightly and replied, "No, Your Honor, but maybe you'll find this story just as surprising." That one line shifted the room's energy. You could almost feel the curiosity start to creep in. The judge leaned forward, still smirking. "Is that so? Well, by all means, enlighten us." And if this were a movie, that would be the moment the camera zoomed in on Nia's face, calm, centered but fierce underneath. Because what she was about to do would not only defend her innocence, it would challenge everything that room believed about intelligence, race, and dignity. Now, here's where the story really begins. And if you're watching this, you might want to turn up the volume. Because within the next 15 minutes, that same judge who laughed at her would be staring in stunned silence. The smirks would vanish. The courtroom that mocked her would rise to its feet. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's rewind just a bit. Who was this young woman? And how did she end up here? Accused, alone, but ready to stand her ground with nothing but her words. Quick pause, think about it. How would you feel standing in front of people who already decided who you are before you even spoke? That's exactly where Nia stood. But unlike most people, she wasn't intimidated by authority. She understood it. She knew that knowledge was a language of its own, and that most people in that room didn't speak hers. Little did they know, this quiet girl from Atlanta had spent years mastering the art of communication, not just through words, but through understanding. 9 languages, 9 cultures, 9 ways to tell the truth. And in this courtroom, truth was about to speak louder than laughter. Because in less than 15 minutes, Nia Thompson, the girl they mocked, would make the entire system question itself. You see, this wasn't the first time Nia had been underestimated. She had grown up surrounded by doubt, the kind that wraps around you like smoke, impossible to escape, always whispering that you're not enough. Born in the heart of Atlanta, raised by a single mother who worked 2 jobs just to keep the lights on, Nia knew early on that life wouldn't hand her anything. Her mother, Evelyn Thompson, used to come home late at night, her uniform stained with effort, her hands trembling from exhaustion. Yet she'd still smile at her daughter and say, "You're going to change the world someday, baby. Maybe not in English, but in your own words." And those words stuck. But the world outside wasn't as kind. From teachers who doubted her to classmates who laughed at her dreams, Nia had heard it all. Girls like you don't get scholarships. People from your neighborhood don't end up in law school. Stick to what you know. But she didn't listen. She translated those words into motivation, literally. While other kids were glued to cartoons, she sat in the local library for hours, flipping through old language dictionaries, teaching herself one word at a time. She didn't just want to speak another language. She wanted to understand people, to see the world through their words, their tones, their meanings. By the age of 20, Nia could fluently speak 9 languages: English, French, Spanish, Portuguese, Arabic, Mandarin, Russian, Swahili, and Japanese. But more than that, she had learned how to speak confidence in every tongue. Still, when she entered law school, a new kind of wall appeared, not made of stone or books, but of bias. Professors looked at her with polite surprise when she spoke up. Some dismissed her ideas before she even finished her sentences. Others mocked her accent when she switched languages to make a point in debate class. One professor even told her, "You're smart, Miss Thompson, but maybe tone it down. Intelligence can make people uncomfortable." She smiled then, the same way she smiled in court now. That quiet, unbothered smile that said, "I'll let my results speak." Nia learned that language wasn't just about words. It was about power. It was the key to being heard in rooms where voices like hers were usually ignored. And now, standing before Judge Whitmore, she could feel the same old prejudice swirling through the air like an invisible storm. The way he leaned back, the way his eyebrows lifted slightly, it was the same expression she'd seen 100 times before. The silent question behind his eyes was clear. What are you even doing here? But Nia had prepared her whole life for rooms like this. She wasn't here to fit in. She was here to be heard. The judge leaned forward, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Since you're such a linguist, Miss Thompson," he said, "perhaps you can explain the law in Latin? After all, it's the foundation of all legal systems." The courtroom erupted in chuckles. One of the attorneys whispered, "Oh, this should be good." The bailiff smirked. Even the court stenographer paused, as if wondering how this young woman would respond. But Nia didn't hesitate for a second. She straightened her shoulders, met the judge's gaze, and said, calmly, fluently, "Fiat justitia writ caelum, Your Honor." The words rolled off her tongue with perfect pronunciation, her voice echoing through the hall. The laughter stopped instantly. Every face turned to her in stunned silence. The judge's smirk faltered. He blinked, slightly confused, and asked, "And what exactly does that mean, Miss Thompson?" Without missing a beat, she replied, "It means let justice be done, though the heavens fall." The weight of her words hung heavy in the air, a truth too sharp to ignore. You could have heard a pin drop. Even the sound of the clock ticking on the wall suddenly felt louder. The same people who had laughed at her now watched in uneasy silence. For the first time, the judge didn't look amused. He looked intrigued. And just like that, the balance in the room shifted. Nia could feel it. She had seen this before. That flicker of recognition in people's eyes when they realized they had underestimated her. But she wasn't done yet. Not even close. Because if the judge thought that was impressive, he hadn't heard the rest. What Nia was about to say next wouldn't just silence the courtroom. It would change the entire direction of the trial. The judge blinked, his confidence wavering for the first time. He cleared his throat, trying to regain control of the room that had suddenly turned from amusement to awe. "And what exactly do you think that means here, Miss Thompson?" he asked, voice heavy with forced authority. Nia didn't flinch. Her tone was steady, calm, deliberate, every word landing with precision. "It means, Your Honor," she said, "that even if the system falls apart, justice should still stand. And that's why I'm here." For a moment, no one moved. The courtroom hung in suspended silence, every eye on her. Then, with a composure that seemed to quiet the very air around her, Nia began to tell her story. not in English, but in a symphony of languages that seemed to awaken something ancient in the room. First, she spoke in French, her voice soft but powerful, describing how a police officer had stopped her for driving suspiciously in her own neighborhood. The words flowed like music. J'étais sur le chemin du retour, dans ma propre rue, quand il m'a dit il n'y croyait pas que j'habitais là. I was on my way home on my own street when he told me to stop. He didn't believe I lived there. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Some looked confused, others intrigued. Then she switched to Spanish, her tone now sharp, passionate. Le dije que tenía derecho a grabar, que era mi defensa, no un crimen. Pero no me escuchó. I told him I had the right to record, that it was my defense, not a crime. But he didn't listen. The rhythm of her words filled the space like a heartbeat. Every language carried a different weight, a different emotion, but the message was universal, truth. And then, with a slow, deliberate breath, she shifted to Arabic. Her voice deepened, trembling with restrained pain as she repeated the words that had been hurled at her that night. Racial slurs, threats, and humiliation that no one should ever have to hear. The guttural sounds of the Arabic phrases echoed through the marble hall, their meaning lost to most, but their power unmistakable. The room fell completely silent. Even the court stenographer, who had been typing nonstop, froze, her fingers hovering over the keys. The air itself seemed to stand still, as if afraid to interrupt. For a long, heavy moment, there was nothing but the sound of Nia's breathing. Then she looked up at the judge, her expression unreadable, and switched back to English. And when I spoke up, she said, her voice steady but full of fire, they called it obstruction. But what I did was defend myself. The words hit like a strike of thunder. You could feel the shift in the air, that invisible moment when arrogance turns into awe. The same lawyers who had mocked her now sat upright, their smirks gone, their pens still. One of the attorneys whispered, "She's brilliant." Another muttered under his breath, "Who is she?" Even the judge, the man who had moments ago been smirking, now looked uncertain, his authority slipping between his fingers like sand. His eyes darted to the papers on his desk, as if searching for something to hold on to. It was as if the entire courtroom had been pulled into Nia's world, a place where intellect met truth and prejudice had no language to hide behind. Nia stood tall, unshaken, her hands clasped loosely in front of her. You could almost feel the generations behind her, her mother's sacrifices, her ancestors' resilience, every voice that had ever been silenced now speaking through her. The judge opened his mouth to respond, but stopped. What could he possibly say? Every word he thought of sounded small compared to the magnitude of what had just happened. Nia had done the impossible. She had taken a moment designed to belittle her and turned it into a masterclass on dignity and power. The courtroom remained still, as if everyone needed a second to process what they had just witnessed. Then, quietly, someone in the back began to clap, a single, hesitant sound that broke the tension like a crack of light through glass. The bailiff shot the person a warning glare, but it was too late. The silence had already shattered. Everyone now saw Nia differently. She was no longer just a young woman on trial. She was something far greater, a symbol, and though the judge tried to hide it, his voice betrayed him when he finally spoke again. "Miss Thompson," he said slowly, "I believe we've all understood your point." But what he didn't know was that Nia had only just begun. But then, just as the tension in the room seemed to settle into respect, the judge straightened in his seat, his pride unwilling to surrender. His tone sharpened again as he said, "Miss Thompson, this is not a language exhibition. It's a courtroom." The laughter that had long vanished was replaced with uneasy shifting. Everyone could feel it, the old guard trying to regain control. But Nia didn't flinch. She simply smiled, calm and deliberate, the kind of smile that told everyone she was still in charge of her own narrative. "You're right, Your Honor," she said softly, her eyes locked on his. "But maybe the problem isn't that I speak too many languages. Maybe it's that the system only listens to one." Boom! It was as if lightning had cracked straight through the courtroom. A few jaws dropped. A woman in the gallery whispered, "Did she just say that?" The judge froze, his face tightening. He had spent decades commanding this space, controlling every word, every outcome. But this young woman had just exposed the flaw at its core in one sentence. The truth of it hung in the air like smoke no one could breathe through. Nia didn't stop there. She took a slow step forward, her voice rising with quiet conviction. "Your Honor, the law is supposed to speak for everyone. But too often, it only speaks for those who already have power. I speak 9 languages not to impress you, but to remind you that justice has no single accent." The room was silent again, but it wasn't the silence of mockery this time. It was reverence, disbelief, awakening. She reached into her worn leather bag and pulled out a small notebook, the same one she'd been carrying since the day of her arrest. It looked ordinary, but the moment she placed it on the defense table, the entire atmosphere changed. She opened it slowly, revealing pages filled with meticulous handwriting, lines and lines of text written in 9 different languages. "I translated the entire police report myself," she said, "because truth shouldn't get lost in translation." You could hear gasps ripple through the crowd. One of the attorneys leaned forward, whispering, "She translated it? All of it?" Another murmured, "That's impossible." But Nia wasn't seeking validation. She began reading aloud, the officer's statements first in English, then switching to French, then to Spanish, showing how the tone shifted slightly with every language. In one version, it sounded procedural. In another, it sounded cruel. She looked directly at the judge and said, "Words are powerful, Your Honor. Change one, and you change the entire meaning. The truth is the same, but how it's told can turn justice into injustice." The courtroom erupted. Journalists began scribbling furiously. A few camera flashes went off. Even the prosecutor, who had been smirking earlier, now looked pale. Someone whispered, "This is going viral." The judge sat motionless, gripping his pen, eyes wide. For the first time in years, he didn't have an answer. You could see something changing behind his expression, a quiet realization breaking through the wall of authority. His voice softened when he finally spoke again. "Miss Thompson," he said slowly, "are you saying this report was manipulated?" Nia's reply was immediate. "Not manipulated, Your Honor. Just mistranslated, by people who never cared to understand." That hit harder than anything she had said before. It wasn't just an accusation. It was the truth no one wanted to admit. The air in the courtroom grew heavy again, but this time it wasn't with tension, it was with accountability. Everyone in that room, from the bailiff to the journalists, knew they were witnessing something far greater than a trial. This wasn't about one woman's charges. This was about the language of justice itself. The judge leaned forward, resting his elbows on the bench. His voice had lost its edge. It came out quieter, almost human. "Miss Thompson," he hesitated, clearing his throat, "I owe you an apology." The words fell like a confession. The courtroom gasped again. The same man who had mocked her at the beginning now looked humbled, even remorseful. He adjusted his glasses, exhaled, and continued, "I may not understand 9 languages, but I understand what you've just done here. And I can't ignore it." For a moment, even the cameras stopped flashing. It was pure stillness, a kind of reverence that only truth can create. The bailiff lowered his head. The prosecutor avoided eye contact. And Nia, standing tall in the center of it all, didn't smile this time. She simply nodded, her eyes glistening, not from pride, but from relief. That was the moment everything changed. Not just for Nia, not just for that courtroom, but for the idea of what justice could sound like when someone dared to speak it differently. The next morning, the headlines blazed across every major news outlet like wildfire. Young black law student shocks courtroom. Wins case speaking 9 languages. It wasn't just news anymore. It was a movement. The story spread across social media, television, and newspapers, crossing borders just like her words had crossed languages. Within hours, hashtags like #SpeakJustice and #NiaThompson were trending worldwide. Everyone wanted to know who this young woman was, the girl who stood before power, spoke truth, and changed the narrative without raising her voice. Reporters flooded the courthouse steps, replaying the footage over and over again. The moment Nia uttered the words that silenced the room. Commentators called her a linguistic prodigy, a rising star, and the voice of a new generation. But to Nia, it wasn't about fame. It was about something much deeper: representation, resilience, and the power of intellect over prejudice. She had faced the very system designed to silence her and forced it to listen. And now, the world was listening too. Inside her small apartment that morning, Nia sat on the edge of her bed, scrolling through the flood of messages. Her phone buzzed endlessly: professors, law students, strangers from every corner of the world. One message read, "My daughter watched your video. She said she wants to be like you, not afraid to speak up." Another said, "We didn't just defend yourself, Nia. You defended all of us." Tears filled her eyes. She had spent so many years translating words, but now, for the first time, her truth was speaking for itself. Later that day, she received an official notice. Her case was dismissed. The judge had cleared all charges, citing a lack of credible evidence and, more importantly, acknowledging the unconscious bias that had tainted the process. But his final words before adjournment were what truly stayed with everyone in that courtroom and beyond. "Intelligence has no color, and courage has no accent." The quote spread everywhere. People printed it on posters, shared it in classrooms, and used it in speeches. It became a rallying cry, a reminder that brilliance doesn't need permission, and that justice, when spoken boldly, transcends barriers. Months later, Nia found herself in places she had only dreamed of: walking the halls of Oxford, standing on the stages of Nairobi University, addressing crowds at Harvard, and even delivering a TED Talk that left the audience in tears. Her story wasn't just about law anymore. It was about empathy, identity, and the unifying power of communication. She taught that language was more than vocabulary. It was humanity in motion. "Language connects us," she said in one of her talks, her voice echoing through the grand auditorium. "But respect, that's the universal tongue." The crowd rose in applause. People from all backgrounds stood shoulder to shoulder, united not by race or culture, but by understanding. Nia's message wasn't political, it was personal. She reminded the world that equality begins not with laws, but with listening. Her words had reached millions, and one of those listeners was someone she never expected. Weeks later, a white envelope arrived at her door, sealed with the official crest of the state judiciary. Inside was a handwritten letter. The signature at the bottom made her heart skip: Judge Harold Whitmore. The same man who had once mocked her now wrote in careful, humbled handwriting, "Miss Thompson, I owe you more than an apology. I owe you gratitude. You showed me that understanding doesn't always begin in books. Sometimes it begins in silence, when we finally listen. You reminded me what justice truly means." Nia smiled as she read the letter, her eyes soft but proud. She carefully folded it and placed it inside the very notebook she had carried into that courtroom, the one filled with translations, courage, and proof that truth has many voices. Years later, that same notebook will be displayed at her alma mater under a glass case labeled "The Trial That Spoke to the World." It stood as a symbol of her belief that no matter who you are, where you come from, or what accent your truth carries, it deserves to be heard. And as the world remembered her story, one thing became clear: justice doesn't need to shout to be powerful. Sometimes, all it takes is a woman who dares to speak in 9 languages and in one universal truth.